Well, thank you everybody for being here. We're so happy to do this webinar with you. I'm Ann Colorado, your facilitator today, and Geraldine Hills is with us. She is the gifted curriculum consultant for Kendall Hunt. So we're both very happy to be here with you. All right, so just to give you a little background on me so you feel comfortable that I know what I'm talking about. I've been in your shoes. I was a 5th grade teacher for a long time. 5th grade is my favorite grade, though I love all of the grades. I have my doctorate in gifted education from the College of William and Mary, and I've used the language arts units for over 5 years when I was teaching, but I'd also been trained at William and Mary in the science and the social studies units and all of these models. And I've taught these models that we'll talk about today to teachers from all over the country and actually a few other countries as well through William and Mary's Summer Institute for 6 different summers. So I'm pretty familiar with them, and I really believe deeply in these units for addressing the needs of high ability learners. I'm now an administrator though, so I've gone to that side, some people say, and I'm an elementary school assistant principal and here in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I'm also the mother of 3 boys. All of them have been identified gifted when they were in elementary school. And the oldest one is 23 now, and then I have a 20-year-old and a 13-year-old. So it's been really important for me to see gifted ed and teaching high ability kids through the lens of a parent as well as a teacher and now an administrator. So that's a little bit about my background. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, so here's our agenda for today. We have an hour and a half together, and so I wanted to spend the first hour really digging into the units. I know there are different units for each of you. Most of you have different units, and some have some social studies units, it looks like. For the most part, a lot of the models are the same in the social studies as in the language arts, but everything we talk about today can still be applied for whatever unit that you are using. And then
studies units. We have a social studies teacher who would like to teach a literacy unit with the English teacher in 8th grade. But all of our units, I think, are literacy.
Okay, it's a little hard for me to hear you.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know where the mic is. So it's in your computer. Okay, so it's in my computer. So, we do have a history teacher here for 8th grade, but she would like to co-teach with the 8th grade language arts teacher. So I think all of our units are literacy.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. Perfect. Okay, so some of the units have a different concept to it, but the way you develop the concept is the same. So everything we do today can apply to any of the language arts units. So the last part of the webinar, I felt like we could address your thoughts and questions, talk about some of the things that Jill initially asked about for you to learn more about the activities, the extensions, time management, all of that stuff, and then leave a little time, of course, for new questions that you might have. So that is sort of our plan. And I want to always start whenever I do one of these with just a little bit of background about these units because they are research-based and they are designed specifically for high ability learners. However, they are often used with all learners, and that is something I think you're interested in knowing about, and we'll talk about that today too. So one of the big things that really works with addressing the needs of gifted or high ability students is giving them challenging curriculum and activities, and activities that are developed with their characteristics in mind and in their talent area. So I'm not sure if you identify students as gifted in language arts. Here in Williamsburg, we do.
Yes.
Do you do that also?
Yes.
Great. So then this is a perfect way to meet their needs. And the models, all the models here and all the curriculum work goes back to Dr. Joyce Van Tassel-Baska. And I am very biased because I had her as a master's student, and she got me into the doc program after many years. She was my mentor for a long time when I was teaching. And then she retired on me once I got accepted into the gifted program at William & Mary. So, but all of this work goes back to her original work on the integrated curriculum model. So you will see how the units are designed around these three main areas: the process product, the advanced content, and the issues, themes, or concepts. And so this graphic just shows you some ways, even if you're not using this unit, these are ways you can address those three areas with your high ability students in your other parts of language arts. I think Jill said you had 90 minutes a day to teach language arts. So you might not just be spending 90 minutes a day on a William & Mary unit. You might have other materials that you use with your students. So here's some ideas of ways to enhance these areas for your gifted students. And then the three characteristics that the units specifically address are precocity, intensity, and complexity, because our high ability learners demonstrate these characteristics every day. And so you'll notice when we go through the units, whatever grade level you're at, the content is pretty advanced. And then there are definitely challenging products that kids produce and processes that they go through in order to produce those products. And there's always the layer of complexity dealing with some kind of concept, mostly the concept of change. Some of the units deal with systems or a couple of the other themes that will come up, and they're listed in the front of the units as well. But also big ideas. And so those really kind of tap into the complex thinking of our high ability students. So I used an analogy of anatomy for this presentation. Hopefully it works for you. But when I think of the William & Mary units, and think of the parts of them, I really see them set up in a way to support us through specific sections that we're going to go through in a second. I'm calling that the bones of the unit. These sections really support you. And hopefully you have some Post-its because very soon we're going to kind of go through and do some tabbing when we get more into the meat of things. But very briefly, if you have your units with you, which I hope you do, I wanted us to just kind of flip through the section so you could see what's in there for you and what William & Mary has designed, because this unit really, all of the units are very meaty for teachers. A lot of stuff in here, so you're not going blind into anything. You can be well prepared for any lesson that you teach out of here. And it starts in the very beginning explaining the very brief few minutes I talked about the background information, much more in depth than here at the beginning of the unit. And it gives you several pages to talk about the integrated curriculum model and how the concepts and issues are integrated into that, literature and discussion, and how assessment plays out in the different lessons and the unit as a whole. Is everybody kind of going through their unit with me? I'm sort of in the very beginning, not even to section 1 yet. Just so you can see how some of these things are laid out, how balanced literacy is considered into this unit. And then this edition that you guys bought, I'm so jealous. I really wish that I had this unit when I was teaching, because vast improvements over the original unit. You can, all these features that they say are new features, to you, you'll know no different. But to me, when I was going through it to prepare for you today, I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I had had that then. But William and Mary is very interested in feedback. So over the years, they collect the feedback and they do analysis of how they can improve the unit. So while you're teaching, anytime you think, you know, hey, I think this could have been done a little bit better, or I have an idea for a different piece of literature that could be used, always feel free to let Geraldine know, and she can share that information with William and Mary. So I think Indiana does Common Core. Is that correct, Jill?
No.
Okay, so it's one of the few states that don't. So then you don't need to worry so much about Common Core, but the unit is, all the units are correlated to Common Core, which most state standards would be somehow correlated to Common Core as well. So you can rest assured that everything in here is going to be some kind of standard that will meet your needs as a teacher and as a school division. So in section 1, you're really going to get an introduction to that particular unit and the framework, the way the whole curriculum is designed. You'll see the rationale, the goals, and the outcomes. There is a letter to the teacher, which hopefully you got a chance to read, just so you have kind of a bird's eye view of what this unit is about. The resources are listed in here, and I believe you did buy the student workbooks. Did you buy one for each student, or will students be sharing? Are they using them as consumables, Jill?
We just have one copy. We just have one copy right now.
One copy of student book? Okay. I was the same way. I'm sorry.
I think they have a class set.
Oh, class set. Okay. Will you be letting the kids write in them, or are they going to be used year after year? Okay. So just keep that in mind. I'm not sure about copyright issues, but students can use the book and just write their answers on paper. A lot of times I would use the student activity book to have them read if we were doing more of a workshop model that day. They could read out of it. And then sometimes I put the models under my document camera so that I could, you know, show what I wanted to talk about on the document camera. So I just wanted to have you keep those things in mind. But all of the readings for the unit are in the student book. Back in the day when I was teaching them, sometimes they were in different places and you'd have to pull them together on your own. But now everything is really included. And so there are short stories and poems and things like that in the student guide, but there are also novels, which I think your school bought as well. And the novels, there seems to be just a lot more than you may need. So you have a lot of choice there. And sometimes I would be able to give my kids choice because all the novels revolved around whatever that unit theme was. So it's good that you guys got the novels too. There are also suggestions of other types of literature to have in the classroom that you might need for read aloud or just for student reference. So those are listed as well. And then information for pieces that you might put in learning centers. There's music, there's visual arts, there's all kinds of resources listed here that can go along with the unit. Some of the materials are necessary for a particular lesson and some of them are optional. So as you read through your lessons, you kind of decide what you need. So section 2 is your tips of how to really implement the unit with as much fidelity as possible. And the first tip is the teacher training, which is what today is getting you started on, your initial training. And then there's a schedule in there, kind of giving you an idea of how, you know, every lesson will tell you about how long it will take you to teach, and you can adjust that as needed. It talks about the centers you might want to make to enhance what the unit offers. It talks a lot about collaboration with other people, especially your media specialist. And I really did this a lot when I taught these units because there's a lot of research that the kids can do in the units. And there were times when my media specialist taught the lessons because we were talking about primary sources and finding them on the web and interviewing people. So we had, math specialists sometimes talk to the kids about surveys and things like that. So there's opportunity to collaborate with peers. And then there's just some samples in here of rubrics and other items you can use with the students. And section 3 is where all your lesson plans are. It starts off with a big overview of all of the lessons. Every unit has about 24 lessons in them. Pre-post is the first lesson is a pre-test, the last one's a post-test. And there's a planner that kind of lays out all the parts of each lesson. And so you could look through that. And then there's a little glossary of terms for you. There's a letter to the family, which you can decide to use or not use, or you could decide to make your own letter. And then there's kind of a due date helper there, and I didn't ever really use that because I kind of made my own syllabi. And then there's the actual lesson for each of the 24 lessons, so an entire lesson plan. And we'll go through one of those lesson plans in just a little bit. So section 4, if you wanted to tab that off, is about the grammar study. Do you have a separate grammar program, Jill? No. Okay, so all of the William & Mary units have a little independent grammar study that goes with it, and section 4 is all about that, and it gives you the background of how to use it, and then the handouts for the student, and the grammar part is kind of integrated throughout the other lesson plans. So it's really up to you as teachers how you want to use the grammar study, but it is included in here if you need that component for school. And I have had training with Michael Clay Thompson, who wrote the grammar study packets for all the units, and they're really pretty good. But we used other products, so I had to use other things for my school division. So I didn't necessarily use all of the independent products here, grammar study here in the unit, but it's really pretty inclusive. So you really should go through it and see if your kids could handle doing that independently, or if you need to make it more of mini lesson and then work on it. But section 4 has all of that.
Not all of our units have grammar study. Is there a reason for that?
Geraldine, do you know if there's a reason for that? Is it the younger units that don't, like the Beyond Words?
No, I thought they all should have something in there. Each lesson may not have a grammar study, but they're throughout like each unit. So it might just be a couple of grammar studies, maybe just not in every lesson.
It might not be a whole section. It might just be built into the
lesson.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
We'll look for that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for bringing that up. So that's good to know. I am using for my reference and for this planning the autobiographies and memoirs because that was my favorite unit that I used to teach. So that's the one I'm referring to. So I apologize if there are some differences from what I'm talking about, but thank you for bringing that up. Section 5 is the bibliography. So basically the units are, since they are so research-based, there's a lot of information in here as well. I don't think all of the bibliography is just the readings. It's also teacher resources too, teacher bibliography. So you can look up more information as well. And then in my unit, section 6 is appendices. And I did hear from Jill this morning that not every unit had Appendix C, which was all about the concept of change. So that I'm not 100% sure about because I don't have all the units at my disposal, but there could be a different concept that maybe they have an appendix about. So if you want to know more about that, about the Appendix C, maybe you could share, one of your other co-workers could share their unit with you so you could look at that concept of change. Do you have questions about these 6 sections? Anybody?
Say it again.
Does anybody have any questions about the sections?
I think we're good.
Okay, and I don't know if you can see this, but this is how I've tabbed everything on mine for quick reference. And then not on this unit, but on other units, I've actually tabbed each individual lesson and put the number on it just so I can quickly flip to what I need. So just one of the little tips that help me. So next we'll get to the heart of the William and Mary units, which is really the teaching models. And all of the teaching models, I would say all 7 of the teaching models will show up by the end of 8th grade. For the most part, from the units I've used, all 7 have been in there. I'm not 100% sure about all the middle school units because I haven't used all the middle school units. But whatever we talk about today, you also can find on the William and Mary website if you needed it. But in one of your coworkers' units, you could definitely apply a model that is in their unit if you don't happen to have it in your unit. So just briefly, teaching models are basically like graphic organizers that kids use to scaffold and organize what you're teaching them. So it will help them learn better. And they're most effective when you use them within a core content area. So like we're doing with language arts, these models can be very powerful. The research that the Center for Gifted Ed has done over the years since the early 90s has been almost all children can learn with these models. And that's why some school divisions use these units with their whole entire class, whether the students are all identified gifted or not. In my school division, I did teach in the self-contained gifted classroom. So all of my kids were identified high ability in language arts, but it doesn't sound like that might be the case for you. And if you wanted to use this unit with your entire class, you really could. You just will need to do a little scaffolding for some of the students. These models really help you get at higher level thinking with your students. They provide multiple pathways to learning, and they really scaffold instruction for the children. So they learn over and over again, using the models over and over again, really help them to solidify their learning and their understanding. And so that's why they're very powerful when we teach these models. You have bought units down to the 1st grade level, all the way through the 8th grade level. And I think there are even some high school units that you might not have even tapped into yet. But could you imagine starting the use of these units as a 6-year-old? By the time these models, by the time you're in 8th grader, you know, you've really got a powerful system, powerful way to organize your learning as a student. When I learned about these first back in 1993 from Joyce, she told our class that these models are like hat hooks, kind of mental hat hooks, where kids can just hang the new knowledge they get on them. So they create that internal schema and they're able to process new information with these models in a much easier way, in a more high level way. So the unit does use the units use 7 different models, and here they are. We also have great description of those models. I'm going to turn to them in my tabs here. It's in section 2. There's explicit instruction for you as the teacher about the models. So for my unit, autobiographies, it starts on page 21. It might be a little different page for everybody, all the different units, but you certainly can follow along and look at these. I'm not going to read them to you, of course. I'm just going to talk briefly about each one, but these are the models. When one of the questions Jill sent me, or one of the things that you guys were interested in, is like, what do you really need to be familiar with when you're using this unit? The models. So this is the most important part of processing all the different pieces of literature and all the different activities. The models are really the base of that. So briefly, let's start with the literature web. I'm going to skip the TABA model of concept development until the end of this part, because that's what we're going to use to really delve into a lesson plan. So the literature web is a way for kids to process whatever piece of literature you're reading. And there are 2 models for that. The primary level model doesn't include the structure. If you see a picture of the model in my book, it's page 25. So hopefully you can find the literature web model so you can look at it and see that. The older grade levels have a piece called structure, so that the kids are, just a little more advanced for their higher level needs. So the literature web is really a way for students to read something and organize their initial thinking about that type of reading. And then they can use that model as a platform for discussing the piece. So for example, once you've taught the kids how to use the model, then you can, do a little mini lesson about whatever literature piece you want them to process for that lesson plan. And they can go work on that. They can read the literature selection. They can fill out their model. They can talk in a small group, and then you can come back together and process. Or they could work with a partner on filling out the model after they read. So there's various ways to use the model, but the main parts of the model are having kids pull out key words from the literature selection, think about their feelings or feelings of the characters, think about main idea of the story or the main concept in the story or literature piece, what images or symbols are discussed in that literature selection, and then the structure of the writing, what type of writing was this, and how did that enhance the meaning of the selection. So like I said, there are lots of different ways you can use that model, but just teaching the kids how to use it properly is, the initial way to go with the model. Once they know how to use it and have used it with you a few times, then they can kind of use it on their own, and you pull them back together afterwards. So the vocabulary web, it sounds like some of you might have been interested in this model as well. And this one I really did use independently a lot with kids. Once I taught them how to use it, they would find, sometimes I would give them the words and they could work in groups. And work in groups to complete a vocabulary web, or they could do it as an independent assignment and then present it. But basically there are different parts to the web that they fill out, and they need a dictionary, and usually William and Mary recommends the American Heritage Dictionary, but you could use any dictionary. In order to really break down a word and understand a lot of different things about the word, antonyms, synonyms, stems, origin, all of that kind of thing, creating a sentence with it, or finding the sentence in this literature selection that use that word. So there's a lot of ways you could use the vocabulary web as well. And William and Mary, the unit suggests that the kids have a vocabulary section in their notebooks where they can keep track of the words that they're really delving into. And it is very it's a pretty tedious model to work through for the kids at first. So I wouldn't give them 10 words and say, do 10 vocabulary webs. We really kind of would maybe do 1 or 2 webs a week, and they could work with a partner sometimes and just really develop a very meaningful word, especially a word that had a lot of multiple meanings or was very impactful in whatever literature selection you used. So I was judicious with using the vocabulary web. The hamburger model for persuasive writing, I think a lot of people are familiar with that model. William and Mary has it broken down into different ways. There are 3 levels of the hamburger model. There's a primary level where you're really just kind of getting at a 5-sentence paragraph where they have a thesis statement or their opinion, and then 3 reasons, and then a conclusion. But as the kids get older, they need to elaborate those reasons and provide 2 details for each reason. So by 5th grade, I was having kids write 11-sentence paragraphs, but they were basically 5-paragraph essays. So we had hamburger essays that were modeled off of this. And then the middle school kids got into the Dagwood model. And I dabbled a little in this with my 5th graders too, where they also needed to take the other perspective, the other point of view, and be able to give some information about that so they could address how other people's opinions affected their claim or their opinion. So you can see all of those different models in this section too. The writing process model is the typical process that most people know about: the pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, publishing, and sharing. There's not really a graphic for this. It's just the steps of the writing process. And William and Mary does put in some pieces into these units where the kids are developing their writing from start to finish. So the reasoning model, and I said +1 because some of the units have a little offshoot of the basic reasoning model. So the basic reasoning model is the 8 elements of reasoning based on Richard Paul's work back in '92. And he also has a pretty extensive website if you need more information about reasoning. But this is something that you really have to teach. All of these models you have to teach explicitly to the kids. But this one I always found to be very challenging because it's so in depth, and there's some overlap between some of the 8 elements, and kids can get confused. So this one I would kind of be careful with it and make sure you really kind of work through it with the kids more than once before you have them work on it on their own. But you can see the model wheel, the reasoning wheel, and it actually gives kids a little bit of prompting of what to put in there. This is one of the improvements in the new edition based on the past edition. So that is great. And just as a side note, your student guides that you bought also have the black lines of the models in there for the kids, whether they want to use it to refer to and write on paper, or whether you want to put it under the dot camera. And there are some Blackline Masters in your bound teachers editions that you are able to copy from. So the +1, the offshoot with the reasoning model, is reasoning about a situation or event model. And this would really be great for your social studies crossover and collaboration, because if you can flip to that picture, in my book, it's that model, in my book, it's page 34. You're really analyzing a situation, and this could be a historical situation. So if you're doing, you know, some kind of historical reading in your social studies class or in your English class, you can have this kind of a crossover where the kids are thinking through the different stakeholders in that situation and the point of view of the stakeholders and the assumptions and the implications of those assumptions. So that's kind of why it's an offshoot of the reasoning model. If you've taught the reasoning model fairly well to your students, then they'll pretty much be able to apply the model to the basic reasoning model to the situation, reasoning about a situation. So then you have the research model, which is kind of like, you know, any other research you would do, but this is really not topical research like, you know, the beluga whale, and the student is writing a report about the beluga whale, which you do need to research. This is researching about issues or problems. And so there are 8 different steps to go through when the student is researching that. And the graphics in here just help the students move through those steps and make sure they're addressing all parts of a solid research product. And then the last model is the TABA model of concept development, which we'll get into in just a second. Do you guys have any questions about these models? And if some of the jargony talk in here that William and Mary uses to explain the models, if it is confusing and you don't really necessarily want to use it with kids, all of these models are described in kid-friendly language in that student guide. So that is a nice improvement over past editions as well. So any questions before we move into an actual lesson plan?
I think you've done well.
Oh, okay. And I know it's a lot to take in at once, but, you know, jot down ideas and questions as we go along. And then even as you're teaching it, you could always email, you know, have Jill email me and I can, you know, give you some help on that. So the lifeblood of the unit, I believe, is the concept of change lesson. And could everybody just look in their unit and see if they have a concept of change lesson? It's usually lesson 2. And if it's not going to be change, it might be something else. And you can just tell me what it is.
I think it is lesson 2 in all of the units.
Okay. So I know beyond words and persuasion, autobiographies, journeys, and destination. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to stop that. Use concept of change. I'm not familiar with connections or reflections. And explore, discover, reveal. So the teachers who have those units, do they have concept of change in there?
3rd and 4th is exploration. 7, 8 is courage. 7, 8 courage.
Okay.
And grade 5 is time.
Courage, exploration, and what was the last one?
Time.
Time.
Mind your time.
As a concept?
The module. Mind your time is the unit.
Mind your time. Oh, okay. Does that have concept of change as the concept?
The concept of time is lesson 2 for that.
Oh, gotcha. So that's the concept. Okay. Alrighty. Gotcha. Okay. So, no matter what concept you have, what we do today with concept of change, you would develop your concept the same way. So rest assured, it's the same. It's still using the TABA model. So that's good for me to know. Thank you. So in this section, I really, oops, sorry, the lifeblood there. I really wanted to do 2 things in this part of the webinar. I'd like to really go into this lesson too, and so you can see all of the different parts of a lesson plan and see what is there for you as a teacher, because it's pretty amazing to me, since I know the original edition, what they have put in there now to help you teach this. And your entire lesson plan is already made for you. So I don't know if you are a division where you have to write lesson plans. I would almost say, you know, if you had to, you could just say, please see lesson number 2 or whatever in my William Mary book, because everything is done for you and made for you here. So if everyone can go to lesson 2 and look at some of these parts. I'm just going to highlight them briefly for you. There is a time frame, and it's an approximate time frame. And for me, I was not able to teach my William and Mary unit every day. I had 2 hours a day for language arts, which was phenomenal. But there were a lot of other required pieces that my division had for us to teach. So I was only able to devote 2 days a week to my William and Mary lessons, my William and Mary units. And I really adapted the amount of time out of those 2 hours a day that I spent on the lesson. And sometimes I broke up a lesson, like concept of change. It's approximately an hour and a half, but it is so meaty that I usually did it over the course of two days, so that we really had time to understand and think about it. And there's another little ending piece to it as well that they've put in here now with a book to read and some other activities. So that isn't necessarily part of the concept of change. So you really, you know, they'll give you a ballpark idea, but it's fine if you adapt how much time out of each lesson you want to spend. They're going to give you a purpose, of course, an assignment overview, so you can see the types of assignments and how many assignments might be generated out of that particular lesson. I know something you wanted to know about was the homework and extension activities, centers. All of those things are there for you if you want to use them. And if you don't want to use them, you don't have to use them. So it's nice to have more than you might need. And we'll talk more about the homework and extensions a little bit at the end. There are materials list, and it'll tell you which part of the teacher resource guide you'll need and which part of the student guide you'll need. So that's really kind of handy. It'll go on to tell you any supplies you might need for that lesson and any books or reading selections. And then I love this part. It's going to give you background or context on that particular lesson. And it'll give you tips and ideas and anything you need to know before you even teach it. So then, of course, there's headings for each part of the lesson, and they're numbered in big, bold font. They'll give you a little sample of this is what the student activity page looks like. So you can see, you don't have to necessarily have the student guide with you and be flipping to the actual pages. You can just look in your teacher guide and see what that would look like. There's tips for teaching. There's the extensions. There's any cross-curricular connections that they think of. Of course, you might think of your own as well. But in this particular lesson that I'm on, this lesson of change, they give a social studies connection. They give an extension. They give the homework. There's notes to the teacher. Especially with this lesson, it's going to give you a little tip that if you're using all of these units starting in grade 1, by the time kids are in grade 5, they might have done the change lesson, 4 times, and they might be like, oh my God, not again. and in our school division, we started using them in grades 2. So a lot of my kids had done the change lesson many times. So it just gives you some hints of how you could adapt it, make it a little different, or streamline it. Something I like about this, really like about this edition, is it gives you samples of what the kids' products could look like. So you have some ideas of what to, that you could actually show your kids. Hey, this is what I'm talking about when I want you to write this What's Important poem, that kind of thing. And then it gives you the assessments in there that you might need for that unit. And a lot of times with the assessments, it gives you samples of what would be a good response. So if it's a rubric-based assessment, you could see what would be a 3, what would be a 2, that kind of thing. So that's a brief overview, and I didn't type it up here, but there's also discussion questions included in every lesson. And I know Joyce used to teach us that if you want your students to really discuss things at a high level, you have to plan out your questions ahead of time. And you can't, I mean, it's great to have a random discussion, but you really should have those specific high-level questions planned out ahead of time to prompt them. And so the unit does that for you, and really a lot more questions than you might even have time for, but you can use these questions in so many ways. Sometimes I type them up and I cut up the paper, and this group's working on this question, this group's going to work on that question. And, you know, it would just be another great way to use those questions. Or you can have a whole group discussion and you're just following along with the questions. So I just want to point out that these questions are really designed to elicit the higher level thinking with the kids. Questions about how a lesson plan is set up? All right. Well, let's get into the TABA model then. So you are welcome to follow along in your teacher guide for this model. But every unit develops a concept, and as we just heard, there are a few units that are using some different concepts like courage, time, or explorations. If you get into the social studies stuff, you'll see systems or patterns. Those also come up in some of the units. So no matter what the concept is, we really need kids to have an understanding of what it means, because all of the literature pieces and selections for each unit will revolve around that concept. So developing the concept is very important, and that's why it's right at the beginning of the unit. So Jill, were you able to get chart paper or markers?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so do you have it, how do you want your groups to be? 2 groups of 7, or do they want smaller groups, or?
2 groups of 7 is fine, or we can organize smaller. What do you think?
I think 2 groups of 7 are fine, because we're kind of gonna streamline this. We're not gonna spend as much time as I would with students. But I think it's important for the teachers to kind of live it so they know what the kids will be going through when they have to do this. It's a very involved lesson, but it's so high level, but it's so fun also. And you'll see they won't be able to stop talking about it, especially one part of this model. They'll just get so hooked on, and they'll go home and talk about it. So I think it'll be great to live it. So if you get yourself organized into the 2 groups and you just need a piece of chart paper, I think the lesson calls for 4 pieces. You could do it however you want. Sometimes I divide the chart paper into 4 quadrants. I think I asked Jill to get, you know, the 8 pieces. So each group had 4 pieces. So if you want to do it that way, we can do it just like in the lesson with the 4 pieces. Is that okay, Jill?
Yes, that's fine. I've got 4 torn off for each group.
Okay. So, you pretty much start off, you know, explaining to the kids that, you know, we're going to be studying the concept of change or the concept of courage or whatever it is throughout the whole course of this unit, whether it takes us the whole semester. I don't know how much time you'll spend on it. I spent a semester on a unit. And so it's important we really understand what change means, because we will look at change through the eyes of the characters that we read about, through the eyes of ourselves and how we change through the course of the unit. And so we're going to really explore what change means by going through some activities. And so on your chart paper, on this very first piece of chart paper, I want you to take 5 minutes. For us, it might be 3 minutes, but I would usually give them a target of like 5 to 6 minutes to generate as many examples of change as you can think of. And before you start, kind of get in your mind, what comes to mind right away when you think of change? So for you as teachers, what things come to mind when you think of change? What kinds of things can change?
Okay, we're on it. They are hustling and grouping up and markering,
Awesome.
and we're ready to go.
So you kind of give them some of these prompts, like what comes to mind when you think of change? What kinds of things can change? How do you know when something has changed? So you can talk about that a little bit before you start the whole brainstorm. And then you also can talk about what a brainstorm is if you've never done brainstorming in the class. Like, we're not dissing anybody's ideas. We're not saying, oh, that's stupid. We're going to write down everybody's ideas. The idea is to get as many ideas as we can. And I ask them to shoot for about 25 ideas. And I give them about 5 to 6 minutes. So why don't you guys take maybe 3 minutes? I'm going to put on my timer so that we can kind of model that ourselves. So take about 3 minutes and jot down as many things that change that you can think of, or ideas that you have.
Yeah, I'm gonna move you so maybe you can see. There are your peeps. Can you see them?
Yes.
There they are.
Yay.
They're quiet.
We might have to do 2 minutes instead of 3 because it's already 4:22. My goodness, I must have talked way too much.
I hear some good answers.
Yeah. So about 1 more minute to just jot down a few last ideas. Okay. Let's stop right there. And so if everyone just freezes for a second, if this was your class and you had small groups working on this, then I would do a little bit of sharing out, and we would go through the entire, each group would share one idea, and we'd keep doing that round robin until all the ideas were shared. And groups could like make a little check mark, oh, you know, they took my idea, so they won't say that idea, that kind of thing. So everybody can hear all the different ideas, and they could add ideas to their list. So that's step one, coming up with lots of examples of change. Can you guys tell me, maybe like each group, tell me one example that you came up with?
Emotions.
Oceans change, okay.
Emotions.
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 Oh, emotions. Oh, yeah, okay.
That's better.
Sorry, but I mean, you know a high ability kid will argue to the death. Oh yeah, ocean changes, and they'll tell you why.
This group said technology.
Oh, okay, great.
Good one.
Okay, so we'll hear the different examples. Sometimes I even make a giant list of all the ideas, and that's something that we'll keep as an artifact for the year, you know, all of these sheets if we compile them into one, that kind of thing. So just food for thought. So now we have to go to step two, which is we're going to categorize these examples. So we talk about, you know, especially younger kids, what's a category? Basically, it's a group, and that means, you know, some of these ideas are all related. So we want to put them together. So that's why you have another sheet of paper. So sheet two is your categories. And so I give the kids, you know, 5 or 6 minutes, and I ask them to come up with categories and put all of their ideas into the categories. And they're always like, well, could it be in more than one category? Well, sure. Yeah, something could. So the idea with categories is it can generate more examples. So let's just say, can you guys look at your list that you made? Who can think of a real easy category for something that, you know, for several of your examples might have in common? That would help you think of a category. Does somebody have a category we could go with?
Okay, health was one from one group.
Health. Okay, that's great. So sometimes I have to really get the kids started even at the 5th grade level. Like we'll look at a list. Nature is one that they see pretty easily, and then they, you know, then they can get going with that. So it's part of that brainstorming ideas. Once we see what things have in common and we put them all together, it makes us think of more examples. So on the next sheet of paper, let's take just maybe a minute and make one, just pick one category and just fill in examples that would fit into that one category, just so you have a little experience with making categories. So go ahead and go. I'll start my timer.
I don't know if you can see this group that's closest to you. They're circling in different colors, the different categories. Look at that. They've been working since you started talking.
Oh, that's awesome. So see, there's always a different way to process things. I like the color idea. All right, we're in our last 7 seconds for that one category. Okay. We have to stop from that, but do you see how the kids will really get into this and want to continue? Could one of the groups share a category that they came up with and the examples they filtered into that?
We're still writing.
Oh, okay.
We had a health category that had diet, emotions, physical changes, lifestyle, age, energy level, style.
That's awesome. Did you think of more, or could you think of more now that you have a category to kind of hang it into?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, you really could, I think. So, you know, the categories will help kids broaden their ideas of change and their examples of change. So that is step 2, categorizing. And so far, we're still in the same day. I'm still doing this together. Step 3, this is the one that to me is the most fun because it's really hard to do and they just don't want to give up with it. It's called non-examples of change. So on your 3rd paper, what I say to the kids is, okay, we have all these great examples of things that change. And we have these categories of change that made us think of more examples. So we really have a pretty good idea of change around us. But what about things that don't change? Because not everything changes. So I want you and your group to take about 5 or 6 minutes and generate as many non-examples of change as you can, things that do not change. So we're not going to take 5 or 6 minutes. I'd like you to take maybe a minute and see if your group can come up with maybe 2 things. And it's really hard, and this is where you'll get a lot of debate. So go ahead, I'm setting my clock.
I would argue, yes, that math doesn't change. The way that they're the method
Okay, my timer went off. Yeah, I know it. Did any group come up with an idea of something that does not change?
Of course they did.
Of course, you're all teachers of the highly gifted, right? So what is one of the ideas?
Over taxes.
Taxes?
Oh boy.
Well, actually, no, I'm just kidding.
How much you pay?
Yeah. Change it here to you.
So, Molly's group, shout out yours really loud. The rest of us have to be quiet so they can hear. Go.
Yeah.
Death.
Death, yes. I would agree with that. One other idea?
The order of the seasons.
Okay, that's one I hear a lot too. Very good job. So the book, the unit has some really good prompts to help your kids go through it. And so here's one of the big ones. What evidence or proof do you have that these things do not change? This part of the TABA model can really take the rest of your class period because the kids will really start some high-level thinking about why things change, if they change, how you know they change, how you know they don't change. One of the ideas that 5th graders over the years have come up with for me that I really love is they talk about their birthday doesn't change. And so, you know, right away there's that one kid, yes, it does. It's on a different day every year. And then we talk about, well, is it still the same day? You know, so you really can get into some great discussions. That is normally where I stop my lesson for the day. And I do give them a homework assignment with this, which isn't one that William and Mary gives them, but I ask them to talk about this, like try to come back to school after talking to their families with another few examples of things that don't change. And so parents have told me over the years, like as one of their most fun, like dinner time discussions. So, you know, it's kind of a way to get the kids really excited about what you're doing at school, carrying it over to the house. But the last part is kind of a challenging one too. And this is where you want the kids to look at all of the work they've done, all of the examples of change, the categories of change, the non-examples, and come up with at least one or two statements of things that are always true about change. Now, of course, if this is courage or explorations or time, it's the same thing. You're going to go through the same process with them. The things that are always true about, always true or almost always true about whatever it is the concept is. So if you guys could take a minute in your groups and try to look at all that work you just did, and on page 4, the 4th piece of paper, that's where they could come up with their, you know, write down their ideas about things that are true or almost always true about change. So go ahead, I'll set my timer for 1 minute. Okie dokie. Do you guys have any ideas?
Change is inevitable.
Awesome. Any other ideas?
But it doesn't look the same always. Change doesn't always look the same.
Okay. Anything else?
It happens to everyone.
Very good. Okay. So what I do as a teacher is I get each group's ideas and we write them all down as a class, and we kind of, you know, I kind of accept whatever it is they come up with, and the kids will try to debate it a little bit. But at that point, I also introduce the change model from the unit. And so we look at what they consider to be the generalizations about change. And these are the things that will basically be woven throughout all of the rest of the unit. So interestingly, almost all of the ideas the kids come up with as generalizations are related in some way to one of the 5 William and Mary generalizations for the unit. So their generalizations are: change is linked to time, change may be positive or negative, change may be perceived as orderly or random, change is everywhere, which kind of is where those ideas you guys just shared could fall under. They're some universal things. And change may happen naturally or be caused by people. So all of a sudden they start thinking about their examples And that's actually the culminating activity where they use the change model and they come up with examples of each of those generalizations. So in the unit, it gives you a picture of the student activity page 2A with the change model in it. And then they create some examples based on those generalizations. So in a nutshell, that is how you develop a concept with your students. And then the key is using the model throughout the course of the unit, which it's strategically placed with different literature selections. So the kids really start to internalize that thinking and that higher level thinking with generalizations and relating it to literature pieces. Do you have questions about the change model or the concept development model? And you might have more questions after you actually teach it. You guys were really good. I'm sorry we had to keep it so abbreviated. I think you could have had a lot of fun with that. All right. So I guess we'll go ahead and move on to the final parts of this, you know, really getting into the logistics of a unit. And I called it, you know, sticking with the anatomy theme, the skin, like holding it all together is the logistics piece. It's kind of like your planning, your time management, the extra things you want to do with the unit, centers, grouping, teacher facilitation versus independent work. So I'm just going to share my thoughts and ideas about this based on my experience with teaching the units for 5 or 6 years, and is just give you food for thought. The biggest thing that I think will help you before you start teaching the units is to read the entire unit. And I did reread the whole unit again while planning this before I really dove into planning it. And it took me probably 2 hours, I'd say. I didn't read every single lesson. I would read each lesson like the week before I taught it. So I, you know, really had a good handle on it like you would do for any other lesson. But just the unit itself, I kind of just immersed myself in it and really thought about the different things, the novels that I had, you know, the pieces I wanted to include, how I wanted to structure teaching this unit, juxtaposition with all the other things I had to teach for language arts. So, you know, give yourself that time to really kind of understand the unit. If you assign the novels, if you decide, you know, you're going to do the novel studies as well, which is all built into the unit, then it's probably a good idea to read them either with the kids or, you know, if you could before. I used to try to read them in the summer. So you know, before I knew I would even start, so I had time and I would, you know, annotate them and think about the lesson plans that goes with the different novels. You know, starting right now in February, there's a good chance you won't have time to read things ahead of time, but you could decide, you know what, we're going to just do one novel this semester and I'm going to read it with them and we're going to do it at the same time and I'll really get to know that. So, you know, feel free to do that and be liberal with what you need. Give yourself that time. I will say, you know, I've taught for 18 years before I got into administration, and I sure learned a lot over those years. And one of the things I learned was reading ahead before the kids, so I would know if anything was going to come up and might bite me. And one of the novels in the autobiography unit, the Beverly Cleary novel, her autobiography is not necessarily a novel, The Girl from Yam Hill, there is a little reference in that to a creepy uncle. And you know, as an adult, I can see she's probably alluding to, you know, he was too touchy-feely or something. But I did have a parent complaint about that once. So that's the only one I know about of any, you know, anything that could come up. But with autobiographies, if you're doing that unit, you really should read the autobiographies first, because it is about authors' lives. You know, they are about authors' lives, and you know, you want to just be prepared for anything they might share in there about their life. Grouping, you can vary your grouping however you want. But flexible grouping with high ability kids is a key anyway. So that's really up to you how you want to group. It's based on your purpose and the kids' needs. Pick and choose what you want to start with this year. I know that you've been really given a gift of all of these resources, but it could be a little overwhelming to do every single thing that this unit gives you. There's probably enough in here, even though these units are designed for a semester, and most of the units are about an hour, most of the lessons are about an hour and a half long. You really could do as much as you need with it, or you could pick and choose parts of it. I told you I had 2 hours a day to teach language arts, but I had a lot of other things I was supposed to use. And so I couldn't give the unit all of the attention that I wanted to give it. But I picked and chose lessons that matched the needs of my division, the requirements of the state of Virginia, and that kind of thing. Even though the units were written in Virginia and they all correlate to everything Virginia standards, so it was perfect for me, but I still did pick and choose what I needed. My first few years, I didn't do any centers at all until I really had a good handle on things, and then I started to introduce the centers. But if you're a real, you know, big centers person and want to get started with that right away, all the ideas you need are in the units to get you started. The homework that William and Mary put into these units, to me, can be very involved. There are a lot of intricate homework assignments. My division, a lot of the schools, and my school is one of them, have gone to a no written homework policy, where homework is really studying, using interactive notes with your parents, and reading, and maybe practicing basic math facts. So if your school is going in that direction, you could easily make homework a station in your classroom if you do something like daily 5 or rotation, something like that. So you could use the homework at home, or you can use it in school, or you don't even have to assign it. It's really up to you how you want to build that in. Same with extensions. They offer extension ideas for every lesson, but it depends on your time and what you want to do with it. And maybe your first year, you might decide, I'm just going to stick to the basic lesson that they give me and really get to know that well first. So that's up to you. Time management, once again, you have your 90 minutes. I don't know if part of that has to be word study, if part of that has to be, you know, it sounds like you don't have a separate grammar program, but, you know, maybe you want to add it. So maybe you want to use this grammar study for your independent work. However you want to do it, you know, just think about what makes sense for your needs from your school and what you're ready to bite off. The teacher facilitation versus the independent work. It sounds to me like you guys might be using a workshop model. So I'm assuming that involves a mini lesson, then the kids have independent time, and then maybe come back to check in. Does that sound right, Jill?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you could make your mini lesson teaching about the novel, or I mean about the model, so that they have a good handle on how to use it. Maybe one day a week you're working as a whole group going through, you know, especially the first time you introduce a model, you really should do the whole thing together as a class or as a high ability group, however you want to do it, so that you are modeling for them how to use the model. So then the next time you want them to use it, you can say, okay, here's the model that, you know, you're going to work on today. You're going to read the selection, and this is what you're going to do in your independent time. And you'll meet with Tommy, your partner, and share the model together, and then we'll come together as a group at the end. So the first time out, you might need to more directly teach the models or the lesson. I think I had mentioned to Jill in one of my emails that even though my whole class was identified gifted in language arts, I still did a lot of reading aloud of these selections. I read almost every one of them out loud to the kids because I had some English language learners, I had some dual, identified kids, and I wanted to make sure that decoding issues didn't come into play, and I wanted them to have equal access to the material. So if you think about that, if you're interested in doing this unit with your whole class, that's a really easy way to differentiate. Do it as a read aloud with everybody, and then differentiate the work groups as they use the model to go through the reading selection. So food for thought. It's just a way that I found to be successful for my students. So those were kind of my tips and suggestions for you. Does that address concerns or questions that you have, or do you have more things you would like to ask?
Anybody have a question? I don't think we know what we don't know.
Yes,
And
that's very common, very common.
like you said, I think as questions arise, I hope I can use you as a resource if questions arise later on to reach out and maybe get some of those answered. But I think it feels like we have enough to dabble, which is what my challenge to this group is to dabble. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah.
It really does. And yes, I am very open to anybody emailing me. It doesn't just have to be through you, Jill. You can share my email with all of the teachers, and I'd be very open to, problem solving with anybody or sharing ideas with anybody. It's very exciting that you have invested so much in your high ability learners and that you've bought all of the components. Like, it's great. I'm really impressed, and I'm happy for you and your teachers.
Well, I can't say enough for our kids or our teachers here, and we just want to get them started out right and hope that this will be the launch of something pretty exciting.
Great.
Sounds great. We're here if you need us.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen.
Take care.
All right, it was very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
You
Bye-bye
too.
now.
Bye-bye.